She had stood in that doorway 100 times before, and never once felt the weight of it. The chapel at Fairweather Park was small, as country chapels went, its walls the color of old bone in the winter light. Its single aisle laid with a runner of dark green wool that had seen 3 generations of the family's passages, christenings, and marriages, and burials. Nora Bassett stood at the back of it on the morning of the 18th of January in the year 1814, and felt the weight press down through the soles of her shoes and up through her spine, and she did not move. The guests were not yet assembled. The footmen were still setting candles in the iron stands near the altar. The vicar, Mr. Trelawney, was at the vestry door conferring with his curate in low tones. Nora could hear, distantly, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. More guests arriving from the village, from the neighboring estates. And she knew that within the hour, Mrs. Constance Fairweather, who had been kind to Nora for 4 years and deserved every grain of happiness the world contained, would walk down this aisle on the arm of her brother, and at the end of it, she would give her hand to a man with a wife already living. Nora's hands were cold. She pressed them flat against the wool of her apron and looked at the altar, and the thing that lived inside her chest pressed harder, and she thought that she had held this for 22 days, and she could not hold it 20 minutes more. The question was not whether she would speak. She had known, somewhere below thought, since the night she stood in the passage outside the dressing room and heard what she heard, that eventually she would have to speak. The question had always been whether it would do any good, whether anyone would listen, whether a maid's word, against a baronet's sworn vows, was worth the breath it cost to utter. She was about to find out. Nora had come to Fairweather Park at 19, the daughter of a clergyman in reduced circumstances who had died of a winter fever and left her with a good education and no prospects to show for it. Mrs. Fairweather had taken her on as a lady's maid, which was a somewhat elevated position for a girl of Nora's station, but Mrs. Fairweather was not a woman who measured her household by convention. She was warm and direct and occasionally infuriating, and she had a habit of asking Nora's opinion on matters that were not, strictly speaking, Nora's business, and then actually listening to the answers. In 4 years, Nora had pressed more gowns than she could count, dressed hair in 24 styles, carried messages, and sorted correspondence, and helped Constance through the anniversary of the first Mr. Fairweather's death, which came each September and reduced her mistress to a quiet, dignified stillness that Nora recognized as grief contained by good breeding. She was devoted to Constance with a completeness that embarrassed her sometimes, because a lady's maid was not supposed to be devoted. She was supposed to be competent and discreet and invisible. Invisible was something Nora had always managed well enough. The plans for the wedding had begun in October. Sir Edmund Colthurst had arrived at Fairweather Park for the shooting party that Mrs. Fairweather's neighbor, Colonel Stead, had arranged, and he had attached himself to Constance's company with the quiet persistence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. He was handsome in an arranged sort of way, his features well proportioned, his address polished to the point of smoothness. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered details, the name of Constance's late husband, the title of the novel she had mentioned in passing, the precise way she took her tea. He was 38 and had been a baronet for 6 years, having inherited a middling estate in Leicestershire from his father. The neighborhood considered him a good match for a widow of means, and no longer the youngest. Lady Harwood, who held court at the far end of every dinner table, and who had decided opinions about the fitness of persons and the management of estates, had said so directly to Constance's face at a card party in November. "He is well established, and not without charm," Lady Harwood had said. "And you are not a girl, Constance, to be thinking of hearts. At your age it is sense that matters. She is not young, and she is not without situation. But she is only a maid when it comes to the estimations of the room. Constance had smiled with the exact warmth of a woman who is very good at smiling, and said nothing. And Nora, bringing in the second tray of refreshments, had heard every word and carried them home to her narrow room like stones in a pocket. Lord James Aldridge had arrived at Fairweather Park in the first week of December, returned from 18 months on the continent, where he had gone after a business arrangement had collapsed badly around him. He was Constance's younger brother by 4 years, a viscount by an uncle's bequest, and he had his sister's directness without her warmth, at least at first presentation. He was 31 and lean in the way of men who have been moving constantly, and he came into the house with the distracted energy of someone whose thoughts had not yet caught up with his arrival. Nora had been crossing the upper landing with an armload of freshly pressed linen when he appeared at the top of the stairs, and he had looked at her with the brief, practiced non-recognition of a man who has been raised to look at servants without seeing them. And then he had looked again, just for a moment, with something slightly different in his eyes, and had stepped aside to let her pass without being asked. It was nothing. It was a courtesy so minor as to be invisible. Nora noted it and set it aside and went about her work. She had been in the habit of setting things aside for a long time. It was on the 27th of December that she heard what she heard. She had been sent to collect Sir Edmund's evening coat from the valet's care, because it required a particular pressing that young Thomas, Mrs. Fairweather's footman, who had been pressed into extra duties for the visit, had not managed satisfactorily. The coat was in the dressing room assigned to Colthurst's valet, a man named Garrett, who was in his 40s and had a face that gave nothing away. Nora had been crossing the passage outside when she heard Colthurst's voice within, and she had slowed because the tone of it was different from his usual address, lower, flatter, stripped of its social polish, the voice of a man speaking where he believed himself unheard. "She will not write again," he was saying. "I have made that clear to her. She understands the situation." Garrett's voice was too quiet to hear clearly. A murmur beneath the floorboard creak and the distant sound of music from the drawing room. Yet Colthurst's answer came without hesitation, and it was not quiet. "Agnes is not dead, Garrett, and I have not told anyone she is. I have simply not mentioned that the marriage in Harrogate was never properly dissolved. There was a dissolution begun, and then it was not completed, and I have chosen not to revisit the matter." A pause. The faint sound of something set on a surface, a glass, a brush. "Fairweather's widow is worth 9,000 a year. Agnes is in the north, and content to remain there. It is a difficulty, not a catastrophe." Nora stood in the passage with the cold running up through her feet, and did not breathe. She heard Garrett's voice rise slightly, a note of caution, and Colthurst's answer came even flatter. "She will not come forward. I have ensured it, and no one else knows." She made herself move. She collected the coat from the hook inside the door, where it had been left in plain sight, and she walked back down the passage and down the stairs and through the kitchen, and she pressed the coat and returned it, and said nothing to anyone, and she lay awake until 4 in the morning, while the house settled around her, and the frost tapped at the window, and the weight that was not yet a decision formed itself inside her chest and sat there. Her first thought had been to tell Constance immediately. Her second thought had been that Constance would ask how she knew, and Nora would have to confess to lingering in a passage outside a closed door, and the answer to that, however inadvertent the listening had been, would be colored by her position, by the fact of what she was. by the ease with which a servant's account could be reclassified as eavesdropping, as jealousy, as invention. Her third thought, arriving in the small gray hours, was the most discouraging of the three. Colthurst had the smoothness of a man who had already considered every eventuality, and that against his word and his baronetcy, she had a lady's maid's wage and no family of consequence left to speak for her. She had told herself she needed more. Some material fact she could lay alongside her account to make it credible. And so she waited, and the days accumulated, and the weight grew, and she began to wonder if she had let it go too long to retrieve. Those days were not easy to carry. She pressed Constance's gowns for the wedding fittings, and she listened to the seamstress pin and measure, and she carried the ivory silk carefully on its form, and did not think about what she knew. She laid out Colthurst's things when the task fell to her, and she did it correctly and without alteration, because she was not yet certain what she was going to do, and because her habits were strong and her nature was methodical, and it was the only way she knew to hold herself together in a situation that threatened to fly apart. At meals in the servants' hall, she listened to the talk of the wedding preparations, the guest list, the flowers Mrs. Fairweather had ordered from the Ipswich hothouse, the question of whether the weather would hold for the carriages, and she ate her food and contributed nothing and went back to her work. She heard the dismissive label a second time in the second week of January in the passage outside the kitchen, where she was not meant to be at that hour. It was Garrett's voice, speaking to one of the housemaids who had been asking questions Nora had not heard, and his voice was level and certain. Only a maid, and not one who has been here long enough to know the difference between suspicion and knowledge. Pay her no mind. She stood in the passage a moment, the way she had stood in the passage before, and then she went back upstairs and did not think about Garrett's certainty, which was designed to discourage exactly what she was considering. It was in the first week of January that she found the ring. She had been preparing Colthurst's morning coat, a different one, sent up for the collar to be brushed, and her fingers had gone into the inside pocket out of habit, checking for any item left forgotten, and she had found a ring, plain gold, a man's ring, engraved on the interior of the band in a script she had to tilt toward the window to read. The words were small and worn with wearing. Agnes Maud, Harrogate, 1807. She had stood at the window for a long moment looking at it. The light outside was gray and flat, the kind of winter light that gives nothing warmth, and the ring caught none of it. She turned it between her fingers and felt the weight of a marriage she had only heard through a door, now material in her hand. Then she had put it back where she found it, smoothed the pocket flat, and set the coat out on its form, and she had not touched the ring again. She did not need it. It was not hers to take. She had not needed material proof from the beginning. She had needed only what she was not yet sure she possessed, which was the willingness to stand in front of a room and be disbelieved. It was Lord James who had given it to her, though he had not known that he was doing so. She had been in Constance's sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon, replacing a small gold brooch that had come loose from its pin, when she discovered that one of Constance's better rings had slid from the top of the dressing table and come to rest, half concealed, beneath the edge of the mirror's base. It was a sapphire ring, not the most expensive piece her mistress owned, but one she wore often, and Nora had retrieved it and placed it back in the center of the jewelry tray and thought nothing further of it until, going to the window to check the quality of the afternoon light for her mending, she saw Lord James standing in the doorway of the sitting room, still in his coat, looking at her. She had not heard him come in. She did not know how long he had been there. "She wears that one often," he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, my lord, Nora said. The sapphire. It was her mother's, I believe. He looked at her a moment longer, and the expression on his face was one she could not quite read, not the usual blankness, not the occasional distracted irritation of a man interrupted from his thoughts, but something more attentive than either, the look of a man who has resolved to pay attention to something he has been half noticing for several weeks and not yet acted on. Then he nodded once, as if some interior conversation had reached a resolution, and left without another word. She told herself again that it was nothing. If you have watched this story carefully, if you have felt the pull of it, the quiet, unbearable weight of knowing what the right thing is, and not yet being equal to the doing of it, then perhaps you understand why Nora Bassett could not sleep in those last weeks of January, and why she lay in her narrow room above the kitchen with her hands folded over her chest, and worked through the arguments again and again, like a woman counting beads on a rosary she has not been given permission to own. Lord James's wound had surfaced on the evening of the 8th of January, at dinner, in a remark so brief and composed that Nora, setting down a tureen at the sideboard, almost missed it. Constance had said something bright about trust and good fortune, and Colthurst had agreed with his usual polish, and James had looked at his plate for a moment and said quietly that he had found trust an expensive commodity of late, and that he had been obliged to take a more careful inventory of what he placed it in. No one pressed him. Constance changed the subject with the skill of long practice. Yet later that evening, when Nora was helping Constance out of her dinner gown, her mistress had said, in a voice pitched for the quiet of the dressing room, that James had been badly used by a man named Penderton, a business associate who had presented forged documents in a land arrangement and caused James 2 years of legal proceedings and considerable expense, and that James had not yet entirely forgiven himself for having believed him. He blames himself for trusting, Constance said, looking at her own reflection. He thinks it was a deficiency in his judgment. He has not yet understood that the deficiency was in Penderton, not in him. Nora said nothing, because it was not her place to say anything, and because she was thinking that a man who had been deceived by someone he trusted in exactly the way she was watching Sir Edmund deceive his sister might be the one person in this house who would listen to her. She set the dinner gown on its form. She smoothed the skirt with both hands. She thought about the ring in the inside pocket and the words worn with wearing. And she thought about James's face at the sideboard when Colthurst had agreed so smoothly about trust. She had been afraid of James. She recognized that now, in the way one recognizes something only after its most acute phase has passed. She had been afraid of his assessment, of the particular quality of his attention, of the fact that when he looked at her, he seemed to be working something out. She had learned, in 4 years of service, to be invisible. And invisibility was protective. A woman who was not seen could not be judged. She had cultivated it the way other women cultivated an air of calm or an easy laugh, and she had become very good at it. And Lord James looked at her as if he had already seen through it, and she did not know what to do with that. She had not let herself look at him directly. She had not let herself count the number of times he had stepped aside for her on the stairs, or lowered his voice when she was in the room, or asked after her health in passing with the careful courtesy of a man who has considered the question before asking it. She had not let herself think about the particular quality of the silence when they were both in a room and neither of them was speaking, the way the room seemed to have a slightly different arrangement of its air. She was a lady's maid with a clergyman's education, and no money, and no family, and no standing, and he was a viscount, and the distance between those two facts was precisely the distance between what she was and what she could permit herself to want. She was not a romantic. She had not been raised to be. She had been raised to be useful. And she was. The night before the wedding was the night Garrett found her. She had been in the linen room, checking the supply of pressing cloths for the morning's work, when he appeared in the doorway behind her without sound, the way he moved everywhere, and stood until she turned and saw him. He was not a large man, but he had a quality of stillness that took up more space than it should. And in the narrow room, with the shelves close on either side, the quality was pronounced. "You were in the passage," he said. "At Christmas." She did not answer. "I thought as much," he said. "You should understand something, Miss Bassett. Sir Edmund will be married tomorrow. Mrs. Fairweather has made her choice. If there were anything improper in Sir Edmund's history, the time to have raised it has long since passed, and the raising of it now, by a person such as yourself, would be seen for exactly what it is. A maid's accusation. Jealousy, most likely, or delusion. One has seen it before in women of your position who form attachments above themselves." He paused, letting the phrase settle. "You would be turned out without a character. I can promise you that much. No one would employ you. You have no family, I believe, to return to. You would have nothing." He left. The door did not close behind him, and the cold from the passage came in and moved through the linen room. And the candle she had brought with her wavered. Nora stood in the linen room for a long time after he was gone. The candle had burned down 3/4 of its way. She looked at what remained of it, and she thought about nothing, because thinking was not what the moment required. The moment required that she feel the shape of what she had been given. The threat, the reduction, the label, the careful articulation of her powerlessness, and feel it fully, and then let it settle, and see what was left underneath when the fear had done its work, and exhausted itself against the fact of what she knew. What was left underneath was Constance, walking into a marriage that was not a marriage, bound to a man who had not dissolved his first one. A woman who had been kind to her for 4 years, and who deserved the truth, and who was not going to receive it from anyone but Nora, because Nora was the only one who had it. And she thought of the ring. Agnes Maud, Harrogate, 1807, worn with wearing. And she thought of a woman in the north in a rented cottage who had been given silence money and told not to write. And she thought that she had spent 4 years learning to be invisible, and that it was possible she had learned the lesson so well she had very nearly let it cost someone else everything. She was only a maid. She was going to speak anyway. The guests had filled the chapel by 10:30. Nora stood at the back, in the shadows beyond the last pew, because she had not been asked to sit and she had not presumed to, and because she needed to be where she could move without drawing attention until the moment she was ready to draw all of it. She watched Lady Harwood settle into the second pew with the pleased confidence of a woman who had arranged a thing and now intended to enjoy it. She watched Colthurst's relations fill the right-hand side, strangers to her, their faces carrying the family's particular quality of composed satisfaction. She watched the candlelight move along the altar cloth in the draught from the door, and she watched Mr. Trelawney take his position with his prayer book open, and she watched the door at the side of the nave open, and she watched James lead his sister into the chapel. Constance was beautiful. She wore pale ivory, with a spencer of soft blue, and she carried a small bunch of winter roses that one of the gardeners had managed for her from the heated greenhouse, and she walked with the upright, measured pace of a woman who has survived grief and knows how to carry happiness carefully so as not to break it. James's face beside her was still and composed, the face he wore in company, and his eyes went once, briefly, to the back of the chapel and found Nora there in the shadows, and he looked at her in the way he looked at her. That working something out attention, that particular quality of seeing. And then he looked forward again. She had 2 minutes, perhaps. The congregation was settling. Mr. Trelawney had cleared his throat and opened his prayer book to the page. Nora breathed in and breathed out and stepped forward out of the shadow and down the aisle, and every head in the chapel turned, because a woman walking toward the altar in a working apron during a wedding ceremony was not a sight any of them had encountered before, and the sound of their collective attention was a kind of silence louder than any voice. Sir Edmund turned. His face rearranged itself too slowly from surprise to warning, and she watched him do the rearranging and felt nothing for him, which surprised her. She had half expected anger or fear of him. What she found instead was a flatness, an absence of flinch, the way the body sometimes discovers that the thing it feared was never so large as the fear of it. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice was steady, which also surprised her. It was the voice she used when Constance was unwell and needed calm surroundings, the voice she had practiced without meaning to across 4 years of difficult mornings and small contained crises. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Trelawney. Mrs. Fairweather." She looked at Constance, not at Colthurst, because Constance was who she had come for. "I am sorry to do this here. I would have chosen differently if I had been given any other moment." Sir Edmund was married in Harrogate in 1807 to a woman named Agnes Maud. I heard him say so to his own man in December last, and I heard him say that the marriage had not been properly dissolved. I have no proof beyond my own account. I know what that account is worth, and I ask only that someone be sent to make the inquiry before the ceremony proceeds. If I am wrong, I will accept whatever consequence is given to me. The chapel was entirely silent. She could hear the candles. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was not as loud as she would have expected. She felt, rather than saw, Garrett rise from a rear pew. She felt the movement the way one feels a change in air pressure. She is only a maid. Lady Harwood's voice, carrying effortlessly over the silence with the practiced ease of a woman whose voice has never had reason to doubt its own authority. She is a servant with a grudge, and this is she speaks the truth. The marriage cannot proceed. Lord James's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who has decided something and is simply informing the room of its conclusion, and it had the quality that Nora had noticed once before, in the passage on the stairs, the quality of a man who looks again when he has already looked, and decides to see. He had released his sister's arm gently, so gently that Constance's hand dropped to her side, and she stood for a moment suspended between what she had come here for and what was becoming of it. Then she looked at Nora, and Nora looked back at her, and something passed between them that required no words, being an understanding that had been built over 4 years of small, careful service, and would not now be dismantled by the fact of its disclosure. "Edmund," Constance said. She said only his name, in a voice that was entirely level. That was all. Colthurst's composure had lasted longer than Nora had expected. He was a man who had prepared for contingencies, and he met this one with a stillness that was almost admirable for the first several seconds. Then his eyes moved to Garrett, who had sat back down in the rear pew with the expression of a man who has done what he was asked to do, and found it insufficient, and something shifted in Colthurst's face. Not guilt, precisely, because he did not look like a man who suffered much from guilt, but the recognition of a calculation that had not carried the sum he had intended. He was silent for 7 seconds by Nora's counting. Then he said, I do not intend to remain in this room any further," and walked out of the chapel through the side door with the measured pace of a man who has decided that a dignified exit is the last card left to him. The room exhaled. Lady Harwood said something further, but the words scattered before they landed, because James was already crossing to his sister, and Constance was standing very still with her wedding flowers still in her hands. And the look on her face was not the devastated look that Nora had feared most. It was the look of a woman who has been stopped at the edge of something, and who is beginning to understand that the stopping was the mercy. James brought the solicitor, a Mr. Bracebridge, down from town within 4 days. The inquiries that might have taken months were hastened by the weight of a viscount's interest and the particular combination of a man's embarrassment and his creditor's willingness to speak once his social protection was removed. The marriage in Harrogate was confirmed to have stood. Agnes Colthurst, living in a rented cottage in the north on a small annual sum Colthurst had provided in exchange for her silence, was located and gently interviewed by Mr. Bracebridge's associate, and was found to be alive and in modest health, and entirely unsurprised by the news that her husband had attempted to contract a second marriage, which she had half suspected for 2 years. She signed the necessary documents with the composure of a woman who has made her separate peace with a life that did not deliver what she had been promised. Sir Edmund left the county before the inquiry was completed. No one followed him. Constance did not weep. In the way that she did not weep at public things, she absorbed them into the same upright stillness she had applied to grief before, and she moved through the first difficult days with a practiced equanimity that Nora recognized as both real and performed, in the particular proportion her mistress had always managed. She said on the 3rd evening, as Nora was dressing her hair for dinner, her mistress said, "I imagine you were terrified." "I was," Nora said. "I thought as much," Constance said. "You did not look it. You looked as though you had decided something and had finished being afraid of it." She looked at Nora in the mirror. "I am sorry I placed you in a position where you had to be the one to say it. You ought not to have had to carry that alone." "You did not place me in it," Nora said. "He did." "Yes," Constance said. "He did." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her own reflection with the expression of a woman taking an honest account of herself. "James has been asking after you." Nora said nothing. "He asked me 3 separate times whether you had been looked after properly. And then he asked you directly once. And when I told him that you had declined to answer with anything beyond, 'Yes, my lord,' he appeared frustrated, which I found interesting." Constance allowed herself a small, careful smile. "My brother is not a man who is often frustrated by the answers he receives. He is usually very good at obtaining the ones he intends." "He is very kind," Nora said, with the evenness of a woman who has been practicing evenness for some time. "He is not particularly," Constance said, with the ease of a woman who loves her brother without illusion. "He is direct, and he is fair, and when he decides to see something, he sees it very thoroughly. I believe he decided to see you, Nora, some weeks ago, and has been waiting for a moment that did not seem entirely improper to act on it. Given that he has just watched you walk down an aisle to prevent his sister's ruin, I suspect he has decided the moment has arrived." Nora set down the hairpin she was holding. She looked at her own hands. "I am a lady's maid," she said. "You are," Constance said. "You are also a clergyman's daughter with considerably more intelligence than most people your station are ever credited with, and you spent 22 days carrying a truth that could have destroyed you and chose to speak it at the worst possible moment rather than let me be deceived. James has been deceived before. He does not take lightly a person who cannot be bent." She met Nora's eyes in the mirror. "He is going to ask you to walk with him tomorrow morning." I am telling you so you can compose yourself beforehand and do not faint in the rose garden." Nora did not faint. She walked with him on a Tuesday morning in the thin, cold sun of late January along the path that ran from the walled garden down to the stone bridge over the stream, and Lord James walked beside her in his dark coat, with his hands clasped behind his back, in the manner of a man who has marshaled his thoughts and is uncertain how to begin them. "I owe you a debt," he said, after they had crossed the bridge in silence. "You do not," she said. "My sister's happiness at minimum," he said. "Though I will allow that a debt recovered does not adequately describe what I feel. I watched a man I could not read walk into my family's house and arrange things very carefully, and I did not see it. You saw it. You saw it, and you held it, and you spoke when speaking cost you everything you had." He stopped walking. She stopped a half step after him, because habit dies hard, and they stood at the edge of the stream path with the bare winter willows above them and the water black and slow beneath the bridge. "I have been told," he said, "that I am not an easy man. I have been told that I am careful to the point of coldness, and that I keep too much of my own counsel, and that the year I spent arguing with solicitors over Penderton's forgeries left me with considerably less appetite for placing my confidence anywhere." He looked at the stream. "I want to tell you that I am attempting to correct these tendencies. I am finding it slow work." "That seems honest," she said. "It is the most I can offer at present," he said. "Honesty, and a walking companion on mornings when the house is quiet, if you are willing." He looked at her then, directly, without the working something out quality, just a straight, clear look. "I am asking you to let me begin, Miss Bassett. I am asking you to consider whether a man who has learned to mistrust easily, and who has spent 6 weeks revising that tendency in light of specific evidence, might be worth the effort of knowing." Nora looked at him. She felt the cold of the morning on her face, and the solidness of the path under her feet, and the stream below the bridge carried the sound of itself past them, low and uninterrupted. She thought of the 22 days she had carried a truth too large for the size of her position. She thought of the linen room and the candle burning down, and Garrett's flat voice naming exactly what she was, and the sound of her own steady voice in the chapel, and the way the weight had lifted when the words were out of her. Not because she had been believed, but because she had said them. She thought of a man who had stepped aside on the stairs when he had not been asked, and who had watched her return a ring to a jewelry tray with his arms folded in a doorway, and decided, apparently, that what he had seen was worth examining further. "A walk," she said. "In the mornings, on a trial basis." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Not yet, but the place where a smile would eventually live. Warmed slightly. And he turned back toward the path. And she walked beside him. And the cold stream moved under the bridge below them. And the bare willows made their quiet sound in the wind off the park. She had not expected to be seen. She had spent 4 years perfecting the art of invisibility, and she had been very good at it. And then she had walked down a chapel aisle in a working apron and made herself visible to every person in the room at once, and the world had not fallen. The position she had held had been relinquished. She could not go back to Constance's service in quite the same way, and she knew it, and Constance had known it before Nora did, and had, in her particular manner, already begun to arrange matters accordingly. Yet the world had not fallen. The truth had stood, as truths do when finally put to their test, and she had stood with it. That winter, Constance went to Bath for the spring and recovered herself gradually and with considerable dignity, and did not write to Lady Harwood for several months, The inquiries concluded, the necessary documents were filed, and Sir Edmund's activities in Harrogate were confirmed to be what Nora had said they were. Agnes Colthurst received a fair settlement from what remained of his encumbered estate, arranged in large part by Mr. Bracebridge on Lord James's instruction, and at his considerable personal expense. Lord James stayed at Fairweather Park through the spring. The walks in the mornings continued. They extended in time beyond the walled garden and the stone bridge, to the far edge of the park where the ground rose toward a small copse of oak and ash, bare in winter, and then greening almost imperceptibly into March, and then April. He was not an easy man to know, as he had warned her. He was careful with himself and kept his own counsel, and was sometimes distracted in the way of a man whose thoughts are 3 rooms ahead of his body. Yet he was also fair and direct, and when he decided to see something, he saw it completely. And what he had decided to see was Nora, with a specificity and a steadiness that she had never in her life imagined being directed at herself. He asked her, on a morning in early May, with the oak leaves coming in above them, and the park soft and green below, whether she would consent to marry him. He asked it in a clear, plain sentence. And he waited. And she looked at the trees. And she thought of all the things she had once been sure she could not have. And she thought of the chapel, and the candle, and the ring engraved in the inside of a band. And she said yes. The ring he gave her had no engraving. She chose the inscription herself, later, when the occasion arose to choose it. It was 3 words, and they were not the words one might expect from a woman who had spent 4 years perfecting invisibility. 3 words only. I was seen. If this story moved you, if you have ever held a difficult truth in your chest and wondered whether the speaking of it would cost more than the silence, leave a word below. She earned the telling. The oak tree outside the window of the house in Aldridge had lost its leaves by November. She had placed, on the sill, a small volume of her father's sermons, the only book she had kept from his house, its spine worn soft with handling, and it caught the morning light in a way she had not expected when she arranged it there. And she looked at it most mornings when the house was still quiet, and Lord James was not yet down from his study, and she thought of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of peace. He found her there, one morning in the last week of November, standing at the window with her hands around a cup of tea. "You are looking at the tree," he said. "I am," she said. He stood beside her and looked at it too, the bare branches against the pale sky, the last of the season in its particular stripped elegance, the small book on the sill between them like a thing that had always been there. "Good morning, Nora," he said. She looked at him then, not at the tree. And the thing she felt was quiet and specific and entirely hers, and she had not been invisible since January, and she did not intend to be ever again. "Good morning," she said.